Welcome back to Networking Explained, Episode 9. Today, we're looking at three of the most common ways APIs actually talk to each other: REST, GraphQL, and gRPC. They're not really competitors with winners and losers. They're just different answers to the same underlying question. How should a client and a server structure their conversation? Let's break down where each one shines. So, before we dive into any one of them, it's worth grounding ourselves in the actual problem they're all solving. At the end of the day, a client needs data from a server. That's it. Everything else is just a question of how you structure that conversation. REST, GraphQL, and gRPC are three different answers to that same question. And the interesting part isn't which one wins, it's which trade-offs you're willing to accept. Let's start with REST, since it's the answer most of us already know, even if we've never called it that. The mental model is simple. Everything is a resource. Every resource has a URL, and you act on it with the standard HTTP verbs. Get/users/42 fetches a user. Post/users creates one. It's built directly on HTTP, which means it's cacheable, universal, and basically the default shape of the web, which is exactly why it's the default for most APIs. GraphQL flips that conversation around. Instead of the server deciding what each endpoint returns, the client sends a query describing exactly which fields it wants, and gets back exactly that, nothing more. One endpoint, one request, even for nested data like a user and their posts in a single round trip. The trade-off is that you're now responsible for designing and maintaining a schema, the contract that makes all of this precision possible. gRPC takes a different angle on that same client-server conversation. Instead of thinking in resources or queries, you think in function calls. The client invokes a method on the server as if it were local code. The contract lives in a .proto file. Messages travel as compact binary over HTTP2, and you get streaming built in. The trade-off: it's less browser-friendly and harder to poke at by hand, but for service-to-service calls where speed and strict typing matter, it's hard to beat. With all three styles on the table, the contrasts get easier to see. REST and GraphQL both ride on plain HTTP with JSON, while gRPC leans on HTTP out 2 and binary protobuf for speed. REST scatters many endpoints across resources. GraphQL funnels everything through one, and gRPC exposes a method per service call. And notice the streaming row. That's where gRPC really pulls ahead, though it pays for it by needing a proxy to talk to browsers. Let's zoom in on one of those trade-offs, the classic overfetching problem. With REST, if you just want a user's name, the endpoint still hands you the email, the address, the settings, the whole package. And if you need their posts too, that's another round trip. GraphQL flips this. You ask for the fields you want, nested data included, and that's exactly what comes back. It's the headline reason teams reach for it. Now shift over to gRPC, and the speed story comes from four things working together. Payloads travel as binary protobuf instead of text, so they're dramatically smaller than JSON on the wire. HTTP2 lets many calls share a single connection without head-of-line blocking. The strict schema means generated, typed code on both ends, no parsing guesswork, and streaming is built in, so client, server, or both can push messages as they go. So let's lay them side by side, because every choice here costs you something. REST gives you simplicity, caching, and universal reach, but you'll pay in overfetching and endpoint sprawl. GraphQL hands clients a flexible single endpoint at the price of trickier caching and queries that can spiral in complexity. And gRPC brings speed, strong typing, and first-class streaming, but it isn't browser native, and that binary payload is opaque when you're debugging. So, with those trade-offs on the table, how do you actually pick? Reach for REST when you're building public APIs, CRUD-heavy apps, or anything where HTTP caching earns its keep. GraphQL shines when you've got many different clients pulling complex nested data. Think mobile apps that hate overfetching. And gRPC is your go-to between internal services where latency, streaming, and polyglot backends matter. Honestly, though, Most real systems blend all three: REST at the edge, gRPC humming between services, GraphQL wherever clients need flexibility. And here's what that blend actually looks like in practice. Your clients, browsers, mobile apps, third-party integrations, hit an API layer speaking REST or GraphQL, because that's what plays nicely over the public internet. Behind that layer, your users, orders, and billing services chatter among themselves over gRPC, where speed and tight contracts matter more than browser friendliness. Same client-server question, just answered differently at each layer. Before we move on, let's clear up a few myths that keep coming up. No, GraphQL isn't here to replace REST. It's just a different set of trade-offs, and plenty of solid APIs happily stay RESTful. No, gRPC isn't automatically the fastest choice for everything. It shines between services, but it's not browser native and brings real complexity. And no, you don't have to pick a single winner. Most large systems quietly run all three, each doing what it does best. With the myths out of the way, let's look at what actually makes GraphQL tick. And that starts with the schema. Every GraphQL API is built on a typed contract like this one. You declare your types, their fields, and the queries clients are allowed to make. So a user has an ID, a name, and a list of posts, and the only way to fetch one is through the user query. The schema is the conversation's vocabulary. If it's not defined here, clients simply can't ask for it. Before we go deeper, let's zoom out and get a rough feel for how these three stack up. REST wins on simplicity. It's just HTTP. Anyone can poke at it with curl. GraphQL leads on query flexibility because that schema we just looked at lets clients shape exactly the response they want. And gRPC takes raw speed and payload size thanks to binary encoding over HTTP2. No winner here. Each one leads in a different dimension, which is exactly the point. Trade-offs are one thing, but in day-to-day work, you'll meet these styles through their tooling. For REST, Postman and Insomnia are your go-to for poking endpoints, while Swagger and OpenAPI handle the documentation side. On the GraphQL front, Apollo is the heavyweight toolkit, and GraphQL gives you an interactive way to explore a schema. And for gRPC, you'll define your contracts with protobuf and prodoc, then test them with gRP curl. Basically, curl, but fluent in gRPC. So, let's pull it all together. All three are really answers to the same question. How should a client and server structure their conversation? REST gives you resources, URLs, and HTTP verbs, usually speaking JSON. GraphQL hands you one endpoint where you ask for exactly the fields you need. And gRPC goes fast and binary over HTTP2 with first-class streaming. None of them is better or worse. They're different fits, and in real systems, you'll often see them combined. So here's the cheat sheet. Pick by the shape of the problem. Building a public API or straightforward CRUD, reach for REST. Many different clients pulling varied slices of data. GraphQL earns its keep. Internal service-to-service calls where latency and streaming matter. That's gRPC's home turf. And if you need real-time, two-way traffic into the browser, that's WebSockets, which we covered back in episode 8. If you want to keep going deeper, the rest of the Networking Explained series has you covered: HTTP, WebSockets, API gateways, TLS, the whole stack around what we just talked about. And one quick reminder, whichever style you pick, REST, GraphQL, or gRPC, the API is only as safe as a server underneath it. If you want to lock that down properly, check out the SSH Hardening Mastery course over at Dargslan.com. Before we wrap up, I'm genuinely curious. Out of REST, GraphQL, and gRPC, which one is your default? Not the one that sounds best on paper, but the one you actually reach for when you're spinning up a new project on a Monday morning. Drop it in the comments, and if you've got a story about switching from one to another, even better. I read them all. And that's a wrap on episode 9. If this finally made REST, GraphQL, and gRPC click as 3 different answers to the same client-server question, hit subscribe. There's a whole Networking Explained series waiting for you. You can also find more deep dives over at Dargslan.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.